It was supposed to be a normal, peaceful afternoon. The sun hung high in the sky, casting a golden hue over the Johnson family's backyard. Birds chirped in the distance, a gentle breeze rustled the trees, and the scent of freshly cut grass lingered in the air. It was the kind of day that made you want to stretch out on a lawn chair and forget about the world. Little Noah, just 3 years old, was playing near the garden, giggling as he chased a butterfly that fluttered just out of his reach. His tiny feet patted against the soft grass, his laughter mixing with the warm summer air. His mother, Emily, kept a watchful eye on him as she sat on the patio, sipping iced tea, while his father, Jake, scrolled through his phone nearby. It was a perfect afternoon. But perfection has a way of shattering in an instant. Noah had always been an adventurous child, curious, eager to explore every inch of his surroundings. He wasn't the kind of boy who sat still for too long, and today was no different. His little eyes wandered from the butterfly to something else, something even more interesting. The pool. It was just a few feet away, shimmering under the afternoon sun. The clear water rippled gently, inviting, mesmerizing. To Noah, it wasn't dangerous. It was just another place to explore, just another mystery waiting to be solved. Emily turned her head for just a moment, just long enough to check her phone. Jake had glanced away too, caught up in a work email. And that's when it happened. A single step, then another. Noah toddled toward the pool's edge, his tiny hands reaching out toward the water. His reflection stared back at him, distorted and playful. He let out a soft giggle, fascinated. Then, a slip. A splash. The sound was small, almost unnoticeable. No scream, no frantic cries, just a quiet disturbance in the peaceful afternoon. Noah had fallen in. The water, once welcoming and bright, now became something else entirely. Cold, deep, unforgiving. His little body sank just beneath the surface, his arms flailing instinctively, his legs kicking, but the water was stronger. For a moment he didn't understand what was happening. He had seen his parents in the pool before, laughing, floating, splashing. It had looked fun, but this wasn't fun. This was different. His lungs burned as he tried to cry out, but no sound came. The surface seemed farther away now, the light shimmering above him like a distant dream. His small fingers reached up, but there was nothing to hold on to. And no one had seen. No one, except Max. The golden retriever had been resting beneath the shade of the patio, his head resting lazily on his paws, but something, some deep, unexplainable instinct, made his ears perk up. His eyes snapped open. Something was wrong, something was very, very wrong. Then, without hesitation, Max moved. Max wasn't just any dog. From the moment the Johnson family had brought him home, he had been different. There was something in his eyes, something deep, understanding, almost human. He had been a rescue, found abandoned on the side of a highway as a puppy, malnourished and trembling. The Johnsons had saved him, given him a home, and in return, Max had given them his heart. But while he loved the entire family, there was one person who meant more to him than anything in the world. Noah. From the moment Noah was born, Max had become his silent protector. He would sit beside the crib at night, his ears twitching at every tiny sound. When Noah took his first steps, Max had been right there, steady and strong, letting those small hands grip his fur for balance. And as the boy grew, so did their bond. Noah and Max were inseparable. Where one went, the other followed. Whether it was playing in the backyard, napping together on the couch, or running through the house laughing and barking, they were a pair that couldn't be broken. But now, as Noah sank beneath the water, his tiny arms reaching desperately, Max felt it. It was more than just a sound, more than just movement. It was something deeper, a connection, an instinct that sent a jolt through his entire body. Max's head shot up, his ears stiff. His eyes darted toward the pool, and in that instant he knew. No thinking, no hesitation, just action. With a burst of energy, Max sprang to his feet. His paws barely touched the ground as he bolted toward the pool, his muscles tensed with urgency. The world around him blurred, the wind, the grass, the voices in the distance, it all faded. All that mattered was Noah. The water was still, eerily quiet, but Max could see it, the faint distortion beneath the surface, the tiny limbs flailing weakly. Noah wasn't making a sound. A second too late, and it would be over. Without pausing, Max launched himself forward. His body arced through the air before crashing into the water with a splash. The cold surrounded him instantly, but he didn't care. His powerful legs paddled, pushing him toward the sinking child with determined strokes. His eyes locked onto Noah, who was barely conscious now. His tiny lips parted as if trying to call for help, but no words came. His little body was limp, his movements slowing. No, Max wouldn't let that happen. With every ounce of strength in his body, he swam harder, faster. The distance between them closed in an instant. His jaws gently but firmly clamped onto the fabric of Noah's soaked shirt. "Hold on, little one." Max's legs kicked against the water, pulling Noah upward. The surface shimmered above them, growing closer, closer, until finally, air. Noah's face broke through, his tiny mouth gasping, choking on air, his eyes blinking in shock. But they weren't safe yet. Now, Max had to get him to the edge, and fast. The backyard, once filled with laughter and warmth, had turned into a scene of silent terror. The world moved slowly, as if time itself had stretched in those critical moments. The soft rustling of the trees and the chirping of birds had faded, replaced by the muffled sounds of splashing water and hurried movements. Noah had broken the surface, but he was still in danger. His small body, fragile and weak from the struggle, barely floated as he coughed and gasped for air. His little fingers clenched at the water as if searching for something, anything to hold on to. But there was nothing. Nothing except Max. The golden retriever gripped Noah's soaked shirt between his teeth, careful not to hurt him but firm enough to keep him above the water. His legs kicked powerfully, propelling them toward the pool's edge. The weight of the child made it harder, but Max didn't waver. His breath came in heavy bursts, his muscles burning, but he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. Every stroke, every push forward was a battle against time. And then a new sound, one that sent a spark of hope into the chaos, a scream. Emily had finally noticed. "Noah! Noah!" Her chair scraped against the patio as she leaped to her feet, her iced tea crashing to the ground, shattering into pieces. The moment her eyes locked onto the pool, panic seized her chest like a vice. Her baby, her little boy, flailing, coughing, struggling to stay afloat. Jake was already moving, his phone tumbling to the grass as he sprinted across the yard. But they weren't the first ones there. Max had already reached the edge of the pool. He paddled harder, his body shaking from the effort, his fur drenched and heavy. With one last push, he reached the steps. His teeth still holding on to Noah's shirt, he began to pull. The little boy, exhausted, barely moved, his body limp against the water. His lips trembled, his breath coming in weak gasps, but he was alive. Emily dropped to her knees, her hands stretching out. Her fingers brushed against Noah's tiny arm, but he was still just out of reach. "Come on, baby. Mommy's here. Come to Mommy," she sobbed. Max gave one final desperate tug, using the last of his strength to lift Noah just enough for Emily to grab him. The moment she had her son in her arms, a wave of emotions crashed over her. Relief, fear, overwhelming gratitude. She pulled him close, his wet body pressed against her chest. Jake collapsed beside them, his hands running over Noah's tiny face, his eyes searching for any sign of injury. Noah coughed, hard. His little chest heaved as water spilled from his mouth. Then a shuddering breath. His wide, teary eyes looked up at his mother. "Mommy?" he whimpered. That one word shattered her. She hugged him tighter, her body shaking as tears streamed down her face. And then, finally, they turned to Max. The golden retriever stood at the pool's edge, panting, his body exhausted, but his eyes never leaving Noah. He had done it. He had saved his best friend. Max stood at the pool's edge, his chest rising and falling rapidly, water dripping from his soaked golden fur. His legs trembled with exhaustion, but his eyes never left Noah. Even as his small human was safely wrapped in his mother's arms, Max remained locked in place, as if he still wasn't convinced Noah was truly safe. Emily rocked Noah gently, whispering soothing words into his damp hair, her own body shaking from fear and relief. Jake's hands hovered over his son's tiny frame, checking for any sign of harm. The boy's skin was cool to the touch, his face pale, but his breath, though uneven, was steady. His little fingers curled weakly around his mother's shirt, holding on as if afraid to let go. Then another soft cough escaped Noah's lips, followed by a shaky whimper. His watery eyes fluttered open, dazed and unfocused. That's when Emily turned, her tear-streaked gaze finally settling on Max. She had always known that Max loved Noah, that the dog had a special bond with her son, but never in her wildest dreams had she imagined this, her family's pet throwing himself into the water without hesitation, dragging Noah back from the brink of disaster. Jake let out a breath, one he hadn't realized he'd been holding. He reached out and ran a shaking hand through Max's wet fur. "Good boy," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "You saved him, buddy. You saved our son." Max leaned into the touch, but kept his gaze fixed on Noah. It was only when the little boy stirred slightly in his mother's arms, letting out a quiet sniffle, that Max's tense body finally relaxed. His tail gave the faintest wag, as if reassured that his mission had been accomplished. Emily gently adjusted Noah in her lap and reached out a trembling hand to stroke Max's head. "I don't know what we would have done without you," she whispered. "You're our hero." Noah, still weak and shivering, turned his head ever so slightly. His lips parted, his voice barely above a whisper. "Max!" It was the first real word he had spoken since being pulled from the water, and at the sound of his name, Max perked up, his tail wagging just a little more. He leaned forward, pressing his damp nose against Noah's cheek, giving the boy a gentle nuzzle. Noah let out a tiny giggle, weak, breathy, but real. A sound that made both parents' eyes well up with fresh tears. Jake wiped a hand over his face, exhaling sharply. "We need to get him inside, get him warm," he said, his voice laced with urgency. Emily nodded quickly. She stood up with Noah in her arms, still cradling him close. But before heading toward the house, she crouched beside Max one last time and placed a soft kiss on his wet forehead. "Come on, boy," she said. "You're coming inside too." And as they walked toward the house, Max padded beside them, never once taking his eyes off Noah. Because his job wasn't done. It would never be done. Inside the house, the warmth of home wrapped around them like a comforting embrace. The air smelled of lavender from the candles Emily had lit earlier, but now all she could focus on was the damp weight of her son in her arms. Noah's tiny body was still trembling, his skin cool to the touch. His breaths were shallow but steady, his little fingers still curled tightly around his mother's shirt as if afraid that letting go would mean slipping back into the water. Emily rushed to the living room, where Jake had already pulled a pile of soft blankets from the couch. She gently placed Noah down, wrapping him up as snugly as possible before rubbing his arms and legs to restore warmth to his body. "It's okay, sweetheart," she whispered, pressing a kiss to his damp curls. "You're safe now. Mommy's got you." Jake crouched beside them, brushing a few strands of wet hair away from Noah's forehead. "How are you feeling, buddy?" he asked, his voice gentle but full of worry. Noah blinked up at them, his big eyes still glassy with exhaustion. He sniffled, then whispered, "Cold." Emily let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. He was talking. He was responding. That meant he was going to be okay, but someone else was still watching. Max stood a few feet away, dripping onto the hardwood floor, his ears slightly back, his deep brown eyes locked onto Noah with unwavering focus. His entire body was tense, as if he still wasn't convinced that the danger had passed. Emily turned to Jake. "Get a towel for Max," she murmured. Jake nodded and disappeared down the hall. A few seconds later, he returned with a thick, fluffy towel and knelt beside Max. "Come here, buddy," he said, gently patting the retriever's head before wrapping the towel around his soaked fur. He rubbed in slow, firm strokes, drying Max off as best he could. But Max barely reacted. His eyes never left Noah. Emily noticed. She reached out, patting the space beside her on the couch. "Come here, Max," she coaxed. "It's okay." For the first time since the rescue, Max hesitated. It was as if he didn't believe that he was allowed to come closer, that his job wasn't finished yet. But then Noah moved. Still wrapped in blankets, the little boy extended a shaky hand toward his best friend. "Max," he murmured again. That was all it took. Max padded forward, hopping onto the couch beside Noah with careful movements. He sniffed at the little boy's face, as if making sure he was truly all right. Then, with a soft sigh, he rested his head gently on Noah's tiny lap, his warm brown eyes finally showing something they hadn't before: relief. Noah let out a tiny giggle, weak but real, and curled his fingers into Max's damp fur. "Good boy," he mumbled sleepily. Emily and Jake exchanged a glance, their eyes filled with emotion. Good boy didn't even begin to cover it. Max wasn't just a good boy, he was their hero. The night fell softly over the Johnson household, wrapping everything in a quiet stillness. The ordeal of the afternoon still lingered in the air, But now, the fear and panic had been replaced by something else. Gratitude. Noah had finally fallen asleep, tucked beneath a mountain of warm blankets, his small chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. His face, though still a little pale, looked peaceful, safe. The colour had returned to his cheeks, and his tiny fingers remained curled into Max's fur, as if he never wanted to let go. And Max, he hadn't moved from Noah's side. Even after being dried off and given a special treat, the golden retriever refused to leave his best friend. He lay beside Noah, his large body curled protectively around the boy, his head resting on the edge of the blanket. His breathing was slow and steady, but his ears twitched at the slightest movement, the protective instinct still burning strong. Emily and Jake stood in the doorway, watching them in silence. Jake let out a slow breath, running a hand through his hair. "I still can't believe it," he murmured. "If Max hadn't been there—" He trailed off, unable to finish the thought. Emily shivered at the idea, shaking her head. "I don't even want to think about it," she whispered. "He saved Noah's life, Jake." He didn't hesitate for a second. Jake nodded, his eyes locked onto the dog curled up beside their son. He had always known Max was special, but today had proven it in a way he never could have imagined. Emily wiped at her eyes before stepping forward and kneeling beside Max. She gently ran her fingers through his soft fur, her touch filled with nothing but love. "You're our hero," she whispered. Max let out a deep sigh, his tail thumping lazily against the bed, but he didn't lift his head. He simply accepted her touch, his focus still on Noah. Jake knelt beside them, scratching behind Max's ears. "We owe you everything, buddy," he said, his voice thick with emotion. The golden retriever gave the faintest wag of his tail, as if he understood, but his job wasn't done. Not yet, not ever. Noah stirred slightly, his tiny hand moving in his sleep to rest more firmly against Max's fur. A soft, content sigh escaped his lips, and Max responded by shifting just a little closer. Emily smiled through her tears. "He's not going to leave him, is he?" Jake shook his head. "Not a chance." And as they turned off the light and stepped out of the room, they knew one thing for certain. Noah would never have to be afraid, not as long as Max was there. Because heroes don't wear capes. Sometimes they have paws.